Conservation Alliance Orchids in the Wild Tour. Mary's very involved with the OCA, so hopefully that'll be starting up again pretty soon. And features highlights of Highlands, Mount Wilhelm, Port Moresby, and New Britain. She's going to be showing us a lot of lovely pictures. Mary is a PhD. She is an independent biotechnology consultant who has been growing orchids, mostly species, on and off for more than 30 years. She's the co-author of several botanical books: Masdevallias, Gems of the Orchid World, Calochortus, Mariposa Lilies and Their Relatives, a compendium of miniature orchid species, and this book that I was just holding up. Mary is the co-host, or the co-writer, excuse me. These are available on Amazon or from the website. Please buy one. And Ron Parsons is our co-author and photographer of that book. And she is also on the board of directors for Orchid Digest, the chief operating officer and treasurer of the Orchids OCA, I'll just say OCA, and is also a member of the AOS, SFOS, Peninsula Orchid Society, and Plural Thallid Alliance. So Mary, I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Corey. And just to be correct, so all of the books that I've written have been co-authored with Ron Parsons, and all of the photographs, with the exception very few in all of those books, are Ron's. What I'm going to talk to you tonight about is a trip that the Orchid Conservation Alliance made to Papua New Guinea in the fall of 1919, just a few months before the pandemic started. And
1919?
1919, yeah. See what this has done to me? I don't even know what century it is, much less what year it is. 2019, sorry about that.
Thank you.
I lost the entire year of 2020. It just disappeared.
So did we all.
So anyway, this was a trip that I led to the country of Papua New Guinea, which is part of the island of New Guinea. And I'll go over the geography in a minute. And before I get started on telling you about the tour, what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about the Orchid Conservation Alliance, just to remind everybody about what the OCA does and the Orchids in the Wild tours. So the Alliance is basically a grassroots organization that was established to create and support orchid reserves so that nature's most amazing flora, i.e. orchids, will continue to survive in the wild. And by preserving the habitat, we preserve not only the orchids, but everything else that's there, the trees, the pollinators, the insects, the fungi, etc. So we basically preserve the entire ecosystem. And we do this in cooperation with various partners in those countries. So we have a number of reserves that we've established. And this is all from the OCA website, which I really invite all of you to go visit. We've just redone it, and I think it's really spectacular. But this is just a review of the reserves that we've created since the founding of the OCA in 2006. And basically, we have raised one heck of a lot of money. A lot of it's been matched with grants from the Rainforest Trust and other organizations. And ultimately, it means that we've been able to preserve tens of thousands of acres of primary forest in some of the most pristine parts of, at this point, Ecuador, Colombia, and we have one reserve in Brazil. You can read about the different reserves on our new website. We tell you about where they are, how they were founded, who they're organized with. Our partner in a number of these is the Foundation Icaminga, established by Lou Jost and his colleagues in Baños, Ecuador. And there's pictures of each reserve there. And very often we'll take groups of people to see the reserves or areas near the reserves, so you can get an idea of what exactly we've preserved. On the website, there are photographs taken from our trips to the reserves and also from Lou Jost and some of our collaborators' photographs. Our partners include, as I mentioned, the Foundation Icaminga. The chief person that we work with is Lou Jost, who spoke recently at the International Speakers Day of the Orchids Digest. The corporation Salvamontes, and they're our partner, is this organization in Colombia, and our chief collaborator there is Sebastian Vieira. There's also the Foundation Biodiversa in Colombia that was started by Marta Kolonovska and her colleagues at her university. And with them, we founded a small reserve called La Palma in southern Colombia. There's also a small reserve near there called the Foundation Yumartan. And again, that was founded about 2014 or so that one was started. And then we've had some collaborations with the SIBA Foundation, with Joe Meisel, who has done a survey on some of the areas that should be candidates for future orchid reserves. If you're interested in helping out the OCA, you can become a member, you can donate. You can designate the OCA as a beneficiary using the Amazon Smile app. So every time you buy something, you contribute a little bit of money to the OCA. You can purchase money from our store, and hopefully when we have shows again, we'll have a booth with t-shirts and bags and so forth. And most importantly, come with us on an Orchids in the Wild trip and see how they actually grow in the wild. We've been to many, many different countries and seen thousands of orchids in the wild. And on our new website, we have pictures of all the different trips that we've done, itineraries, articles that have been published in magazines, and you can read all about them and enjoy the pictures and hopefully get really excited. We have several tours now planned for 2022. We decided, given the current COVID situation, that we're not going to try to go to third world countries like Ecuador or Colombia because the pandemic is just raging there and people in general are not vaccinated, but we would do 2 tours to Europe. One will be to Sicily, April 9th to the 20th, and the other one to Switzerland, June the 12th to the 27th. Registration is now open, and you can learn more about it by visiting the OCA website. The itineraries are posted there, as well as information about how to join the tour. And this is the page that's on the website for the Papua New Guinea trip. And there's 5 pages of pictures that you can go through and look at. And you'll see a lot of these tonight, but it just gives you an idea of the kinds of things that we see on our tours. For the OCA trip to New Guinea, there's a nice itinerary brochure that was made, as well as a beautiful article that one of our tour participants, Spiro Kosomenakis, did for the Orchids magazine, and you can read more about that. The article is also linked on our website as a PDF file. So let's get started and go to Papua New Guinea. So where is Papua New Guinea? Well, if you look at the map of the world or a globe, it sits basically above the country of Australia. And as you can see, it's a large island, but half of it is the independent country of Papua New Guinea, and the other half is a protectorate or part of Indonesia. It used to be called Irian Jaya, but now it is basically a part of Indonesia. And then there's some islands off the coast of New Guinea that are also part of Papua New Guinea, including this very large island here, which is the island of New Britain, which we also visited on our tour. Papua New Guinea is an absolutely fascinating place. It's one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world. There are over 850 languages. That is 1 in 10 of the world's languages that are spoken there. It has a very strong tribal culture. People belong to a tribe rather than a family. Their family is their tribe. And there's many traditions that are passed down through the tribes with regards to marriage, celebration, coming to adulthood, and so forth, which are different for every tribe. And because of all of these languages, they can't really speak to each other because there's so many different languages. So the common language that is used is Pidgin English, which is actually kind of an interesting language. It's one of the world's least explored countries, with many areas still to be explored, and probably thousands of orchids yet to be described. And it's thought that there are still groups of uncontacted people in some of the more remote areas. It's also a country that is tangled in time. In the interior parts of Papua New Guinea, many of the tribes had no contact with Europeans until the mid-1930s. And so up until the mid-1930s, it was basically a Stone Age population with Stone Age tools, no gunpowder, a lot of the things that we think of as, modern civilization were completely foreign to them. And so they got pushed into the 20th century in a hurry, and it has resulted in irreversible changes in their culture. There are a myriad of churches. Almost every tribe belongs to a different religion because missionaries came in and basically introduced their beliefs into the different tribes. And it's really fascinating because the traditions of the tribal culture are intermingled with the various versions of the Christian religion, and you have all kinds of interesting variations on religion. And as a consequence, it's a mix of the old and the new. And so the young people have cell phones, Facebook, etc., even though much of the interior still has no electricity, almost no roads, and still occasionally violent tribal conflicts. One of the most interesting things that I've enjoyed over the last year is that my guide in New Guinea has a cell phone, and every once in a while we talk using Messenger, and he shows me his sweet potatoes in his garden with his cell phone, and I show him my roses and orchids in my garden with his. Who could imagine that you could have done that? So it's countries and civilizations so distant and so far apart. So the tour that we did that I'm going to talk about was, as I mentioned, done in the end of September, the early part of October in 2019. I did, however, make a trip at exactly the same time the year prior, basically on my own as a scouting trip to figure out what places to go and what places to visit. And I visited many of the same places that I visited with the group in 2019, but because of slight differences in the weather, some of the orchids that we saw in bloom on the second trip were different than the ones we saw on the first trip, and vice versa. So when I talk about certain places, I may show you some photographs that were taken in 2018 as well. So we started off in Port Moresby and we flew to Mount Hagen. If you look carefully at this map, you can see that there are no roads except along the coast. This is basically all forested with tracks, no roads at all, till you get to Mount Hagen. And then there's some roads that kind of go down to the coast and a few roads here, but the rest of the country is pretty much roadless. And to go anywhere, it used to be that if you wanted to visit a remote lodge or something, you actually had to go by plane or by helicopter. And that's still the case with some of the more remote tour lodges and so forth. We also climbed Mount Wilhelm, which is over in this area. And then the later part of the trip, we visited the island of New Britain, specifically Rabaul, which I'll talk about when we get there. So we land in Mount Hagen and we stay at this wonderful lodge called Magic Mountain Lodge. And so the lodge is this little cluster of huts that you can see here. This is a photo taken from a drone by my friend Stuart McPherson. So he sent the drone up from here and then went up and took the picture from way up in the air. Obviously, we didn't get up there. And this is the actual Magic Mountain that the lodge is named after, but it sits at the base of Mount Hagen, which is one of the tallest mountains in New Guinea. But I hope you can get the idea that look how dense this forest is. There are no trails, there are no roads, there are no paths. The only way you're going to get to any of these places is basically to bushwhack. There are some trails that go up to Mount Hagen, but you can very quickly get into the woods and find all kinds of interesting plants, orchids, and so forth, and amazing, amazing birds. So these are just a few of the orchids that were around our cabins. So this is Mediocalcar, we think it might be bifolium, and Dendrobium sulphureum. Also growing on the grounds of the lodge with this Epiblastis monhageni. And then as we walk down from the lodge to the highway, The road was too steep for the bus to go up, so we had to walk up and down to the lodge every day. And this little pterostylis was growing right along the road as we walked down to where our bus was. One of the first places that we visited was a lodge best known for its birds. This is the Kamul Birding Lodge. It's in Enga province. And basically what you do is you go and you sit in these blinds at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you put out fruit for the birds to come, and you just sit there and get these great pictures. So as we sat there for a couple of hours, we had a great view of all of these interesting birds that came, including parrots. These two, the brown sicklebill and the ribbon-tailed astrapia, are actually two of the birds of paradise that came, and they were really wonderful birds to see. And then after leaving the lodge, we walked down through the forest. And you can walk from where the lodge is down through the forest back down to the highway. So it's about I don't know, maybe a mile walk at the most, but you walk through this wonderful, just amazing cloud forest that is just loaded with all kinds of plants, lots of orchids, lots of ferns, gesneriads, all kinds of interesting things. And so this plant over here, this Dendrobium habamensi, we saw probably 20 or 30 plants of it in bloom on the trip in October of 2019. In 2018, we only saw one plant. So just a slight difference in timing and the weather and differences in the bloom times. Also on this walk, we found quite a few of these terrestrial orchids, Liparis altagina, and then this cute little bulbophyllum, which we've tentatively identified as Brachypus. Freetia is a very common species, kind of like Stelis is in the New World. We saw lots of different plants of it, and this is just one of them. They're almost impossible to identify, so they got the name of Spa. There were really literally hundreds of different bulbophyllums that we saw, and most of them we really have not been able to identify. There could very well be some of them are yet to be described. This one is very similar to one called Longelabre. And here the flower itself is about 3 inches from the top of the dorsal sepal down to the bottom of the lip that's shown here. When we got to the bottom, close to the road, we met Max Mao, who's an interesting fellow. He goes out and in that same forest that we walked through, as well as some of the surrounding forest, he'd gone out and collected different orchids and basically just moved them into his property. And he has this wonderful orchid garden where everything is growing wild. It's just tied to a tree or tied to a post. And it's just loaded with all kinds of stuff. And the nicest thing about his garden was everything was at eye level and you didn't have to climb up the trees to the very top to see things. But all of the plants that he has growing here basically come from that very same forest that we had just walked through. And this is Max here showing one of his Dendrobium cuthbertsonii. And we saw lots of these in his garden. Here's just a few of them. It was really exciting to see those. We did see those in the trees as we walked down through the forest, but they were way up in the trees and basically impossible to get a picture of unless you had a super duper telephoto lens. And here's just some more of the different dendrobiums that we saw in his garden. Dendrobium subclausum, we saw several places on the trip. This was the first place that we saw it. Elatocallium, Calicumentum. I think this is Dendrobium nardoides. It looks a little bit like Helwigii, but it's a little different. And then these two are the Laturia type Dendrobiums, rigidifolium and Dendrocolloides. Also growing here, we found lots of different bulbophyllum species. And here's just a few of them. And it's like, again, I apologize for not having names on a lot of them, but this one is called Lepanthiflorum, which means has a flower that looks like a Lepanthes. This is a bulbophyllum that we think is in section Hyoscema. This one we think might be Trachyanthem. This one is in the section Cadonosyphon. This one in section Pedilochylis. And then this one we think is Bulbophyllum revii. This one was really interesting. The actual flowers are probably 6 to 6.5 inches long from where the ovary is down to the end of the sepals. We saw quite a few of these. This is a stick orchis. It used to be the genus Liparis. Again, they all look pretty similar and it's difficult to tell them apart. So again, it's a SPA. We saw lots of different Ceratostylus species, most of them pretty insignificant. I think this is just an example of one of the insignificant ones. Again, more bulbophyllum. This is one of the uglier ones, if you could call orchids ugly, called agrostophyllum, and there were a number of different species of that. None of them were very attractive. And then there was lots of different mediocalcar. This is another one that I think is bifolium. And then here's another Ceratostylus. After visiting the Max's garden, we then took a little bit of a culture interlude or a day off from orchids to see a number of the sites in and around Mount Hagen. We visited the market, we visited the Hoolywigman and also the Asaro mudmen. And the chap over here is one of the mudmen, which I'll talk about in a minute. So in visiting any country, it's always fun to go visit the market because you get a really good flavor for what people eat, what they sell, and just the general feel of the place. And I must say that everyone here was so friendly. They all wanted to shake your hand and talk to you and tell you about their vegetables. And this lady here is selling these handcrafted handbags called billums, which are really a trademark of Papua New Guinea. They're a micro economy for the women, actually. They now started exporting them all over the world, but they're really delightful little bags and they basically serve the purpose of a purse. But there's larger ones that they use as basically your equivalent of the Trader Joe's reusable shopping bag to pick your groceries and so forth with. And all the women have billums that they carry around with their money and everything in it. And so this lady is showing us one of her vegetables at the market. Now, we then visited the Hoolywigman. The Hoolywigman originally come from a different province, but a lot of the tribes have purchased land in and around Mount Hagen because Mount Hagen has the best school system around. So a lot of the tribes have small areas here where they establish a village and then the children can get an education. The Hoolywigman is one of the largest cultures in New Guinea. There's many, many different villages throughout the island. They are characterized by these wigs that they wear on their heads. And the story about how these wigs come about is actually quite interesting. At about age 14, the boys are segregated and basically go on a special diet and grow and groom their hair for about 18 months into these bizarre shapes that you see these guys wearing on their heads. And then it's basically combed into that shape and shorn off right at their head level. So that then they basically have a wig, and into that wig, they stuff all kinds of decorations. So shown here, we can see them with intact entire birds of paradise stuck into the wig, feathers. This is the feathers of the Ragiana bird of paradise. And lots of different decorations. And these wigs are very precious and stored in a special hut where they keep the wigs. And some of them will actually create 3 to 4 wigs before they're the age of 18. And the story is that the wigs can only be made by boys who have not been married. So before they marry, they have to create these wigs. And then they have these elaborate traditional costumes, which, as you can see, have all kinds of interesting decorations. They paint their face with this very characteristic yellow ochre on the top of the face. They have bones or sticks going through their nose. If they turn around, you'll see that there's a cassowary bill on their back. And then they have a very characteristic dance. And there we have one of them. And you can see that you can imagine how long it takes them to put on their makeup, and they have these little tiny mirrors that they do it by. And then here you can see the elaborate nature of this guy's wig with flowers and trees and all kinds of things in it. And it was really fascinating. After visiting the Hoolywigman, we then went to visit another tribe, which is called the Asaro Mudmen. And they actually come from yet a different province of Papua New Guinea originally. But again, they've purchased land in and around Mount Hagen for their tribe and also for their children. So actually they put on a wonderful display for us, but it was actually the kids who did it. So these are all young boys about, I don't know, 12 to 15 years old. And they're wearing these masks that are made of clay, that each of them makes their own mask. And these masks are really heavy. They're probably 15 to 20 pounds. And I know that because we all tried one on and they were really heavy. And then they wear these bamboo spiky finger coverings and they clack them together. And the story is that their village had been invaded by another tribe and taken over their land, and they were as strong as this other village. So they came up with this ingenious way of scaring off the other tribe by covering their bodies with this grayish clay and these bizarre masks and making these clacking sounds with their bamboo fingers. And they would come out of the bush in the dark making these noises, as you can see here. So here they come out of the bush making those noises.
Better hurry.
So that was the Mudmen. After we visited with them, they showed us how to throw spears. We had a great time learning more about their culture. And each of these little villages, after they did their demonstration, they had lots of knickknacks and souvenirs. So I think a lot of us came home with little tiny Mudmen as one of our souvenirs. And here's one of the masks. You can see how elaborate they are. And the teeth that are in there are actually pig's teeth. Here's another one. And here's me with my Mudman mask on. I look really scary. All right, so after visiting that, we had a really unusual event. So in late August in Papua New Guinea, there's a big festival called the Sing Sing, where thousands of tourists come every year. And it's a big, big event. And we were there in October, but the prime minister and the governor of the province were having this big political event. So all of the tribes got together and they put on a Sing Sing for the visiting politicians. So here's all the crowds that had come to see the politicians. Here's the poster they had up over the area. And here's what we saw when we basically got out of the car, and there was just all these amazing different tribes represented. These are not Hoolywigmen, they are not Mount Hagen Wigmen. They're some other tribe altogether. I honestly don't know which one it was. And they loved posing for pictures. So we got some great photos. I actually got my face made up like one of these guys. It was all painted up and so forth. And everybody thought that was pretty funny. And then here's one of the ladies, and she's wearing a necklace of shells and a skirt. And as you can see, she's completely braless, and they all were. But if their face made up, I guess no one could tell who you were. So maybe it didn't matter. And then here's more of the people all dressed in their finest. And this was just amazing because we were the only, there was 8 of us or 10 of us, I guess. And we were the only white people there. Everybody else was a native Papua New Guinean, and everyone was so gracious, and just, we got to march in the parade with everybody, and it was just a great fun time. And then here's Dennis Sesko, who was one of the chaps on our trip, and posing for a picture with one of the villagers. So that was great fun. After that, we went on another forest hike, this time to a spirit cave. And a custom that they have in many places is that they they don't actually bury their dead there, but they honor their dead in these caves up in the mountains, and they're placed there with pigs. So pigs are very revered in New Guinea. So here's the skulls, and then these are actually jaws of pigs. And so this was in the cave. This was the scary guy that was outside of the cave before we got to it to scare you off. And then we walked through this area and then up to this wonderful waterfall. And along the way, we found some really interesting plants. This is a balanophora. It's a saprophytic plant, doesn't have any chlorophyll. And these are actually the flowers of the plant. And we found quite a few of these. These were found on the 2018 trip. On the 2019 trip, there were a few, but they were basically all done when we walked through. And at the end of the trail was this wonderful waterfall. But along the trail, we saw lots of orchids. And here's just a few of them. This is a little terrestrial Liparis. Here's another one of the Dendrobium subclausum again, a bulbophyllum, similar to the one I showed earlier, which I've forgotten the name of now. This is Dendrobium neuroglossum. We saw lots of these, which Ron helped me identify as Glossophrynca. We saw quite a few different species of this genus, and yet another mediocalcar. And of course, when you do a hike in New Guinea, you don't go by yourself. The entire village goes with you. So here were all my helpers. They carried your backpack and they told you all about their village. And this was Grandma, who we got to meet. And I believe these are all somehow related to each other. But the village was at the base of the trail to the cave. And the young man sitting next to me basically was my guide and helped me get up the steep steps and so forth to get up to the cave. So after that, we attended yet another amazing festival, and this is called a mumu, or a Papuan pig roast. So I don't mean to gross out the vegetarians in the audience, but in New Guinea, pigs are very revered. A pig is a sign of wealth. And someone who's wealthy might have 4 or 5 pigs, and if you're really wealthy, you might have 20 pigs. A pig is worth about $4,000 to $5,000 US. So it was a really big deal that they butchered a pig and put on this pig roast for us. So here's how they did the pig roast. They dug a deep pit. They put hot rocks in the bottom of it, covered it with leaves, put meat and potatoes and all kinds of vegetables in, and then covered it up with leaves. And then we went away for 4 or 5 hours while it cooked under this leaf. So it's basically a pit roast with pig and all kinds of vegetables and so forth in it. While our dinner was cooking, this is the Mount Hagen wigmen, different from the Huli wigmen, who put on yet another wonderful display for us. This is, again, you can see they have wigs similar to the Huli wigmen, but their makeup on their face is completely different, as is their costume. And they had a great time letting us dance with them and so forth. So here I am dancing with them. And here's the women who also put on a show for us. So I call it the Mount Hagen Wig Women. Anyway, they put on a show. And interestingly, some of us got really carried away. So this is Lois Dahlsberg, who really had a great time dancing with the women and got totally carried away with it. And then here's a picture of them outdoors, and you can see how colorful their costumes are. This shell that's around their neck is called a kiva shell. This used to be the currency of New Guinea, and so their equivalent of $1 is still called a kiva, and it's worth about, I don't know, 30 or 40 cents. And that used to be how that they would barter and trade for things. And then here's the men of the village. This fellow over here is the chief. And then these are 3 of the elders of the village. And then here's a close-up of the incredibly elaborate wig that he had on, with entire birds of paradise stuck into his wig. And then this is the chief again, and this is his son, and this is the chief's 3 wives. So they have polygamy in some parts of it. Like I said, the mixture of culture and religion is a little confusing. But interestingly, when the chief steps down as chief and his son takes over, he inherits all 3 wives. I'm not sure if he's looking forward to that or not, but anyway, that's his legacy. And then we're going to have everyone from the village gathered around, and we had a great time enjoying the roasted pig and the vegetables and so forth. And everybody got involved. So here's a lot of the villagers eating, the kids, and even the dogs got lots of scraps. So fun was had by all. After visiting the Mount Hagen Wigman, the next day we visited another garden, and this is a place run by a fellow named Mr. Pint. He lives on the other side of Mount Hagen in a completely different habitat. And he, like Max, who I talked about earlier, has managed to go up in the forest and bring down and collect orchids that are from the surrounding area and put them into his garden. And he's been busily improving his garden, trying to have a good representation of the orchids that are in the area. And I think one of the reasons for doing this is it is so difficult to go and see them in the wild because of the lack of trails. And the only way to get in the mountains is you have to walk across probably 2 or 3 or 4 miles of pineapples and sweet potato fields and so forth, just to get to the forest, because again, there are no roads, there are no horses, donkeys, motorcycles, etc. The only way you get from the main road to the forest is you have to walk. So being able to see these in these gardens was really special. So here's just a few of the things that he had in his garden. And he really liked these oxyglossum type dendrobiums. So he had lots of the different color forms of Vexillarius, Dendrobium helwigianum, Cyanocentrum, and this beautiful little plant of Subuliferum. And here's just a few more things that were in his garden. A different style of species, not coalescens, it might be Papuana. This is a Sarcochilus, although Ron thought it might have been moved to a different genus by now. And then a big area plant, we saw Dendrobium parvulum, yet another Mediocalcar. And then something we don't see very often here in cultivation, Dendrobium subacale. And then right next to his garden, he had this big expanse of mud that we walked through. And then there was this big dry area of lots of grasses and so forth. And we found an amazing number of orchids in there, none of them in bloom, but we did find huge colonies of this Nepenthes. So this is a carnivorous plant. The pictures that you can see here basically catch small insects and so forth. And these plants grow in nutrient poor soils. And this particular one is Nepenthes maxima. And here's a close-up of the picture. So after visiting Mr. Pint, we then went to yet another tribal area to see the Chimbu skeleton men. They come from the province of Chimbu, which is between Mount Hagen and the coast. It's actually where Mount Wilhelm is, which we'll talk about in a minute. And their tradition here is to basically paint their body like skeletons. And again, there was a tradition that went with it, that they dressed up like this to scare off another tribe that had tried to take over their lands. And so they walk like skeletons, I guess. But their painting of their, the skeletons was actually reasonably accurate. And the way they moved and so forth was, like ghostly walking through the woods. So that was kind of fun. And the garden that they did the demonstration in was just amazing. We got to all get great pictures with the skeleton men. So here's, I think that's Lois Dalsberg's husband, Larry. And here I am posing with the skeleton men. In the garden, just in and around the village, there were lots of orchids, including this wonderful Diplocolobium chrysotopsis. The chief of that village loved the heliconias from South America, and he had an amazing collection of these growing all around his garden. And of course, everybody had fun putting the flowers on their noses and posing for pictures. And then here's a few more of the orchids that were in his collection shown below. So Laturia type, Fenestriae and Forbesii, and then this unidentified little bulbiform species. Another place that we visited was this lodge called Rondon Ridge. And if you're really wealthy and go to Papua New Guinea, this is where you stay. It's about $500 a night. You don't have any interaction with the locals like we did, but you have these beautiful rooms and great food and a gorgeous view and a beautiful orchid garden right behind the lodge. We went here actually for lunch and it was delicious. And they have a great souvenir shop in the hotel that has some great artifacts. And it's probably known worldwide as a profound bird watching paradise. But we also explored the backside of the mountain here. Only a couple of us did that. The rest of the group went down to the lodge. But after we climbed up to the ridge to see the birds, the rest of the group went to the lodge, and I think Dennis, myself, and one of the other group, we walked down this area where there was no trail and just explored the backside. We found all kinds of interesting orchids and other plants on that hike. But what we'd gone there to see was this bird. This is the King of Saxony bird of paradise. And it displays at the very top of the tree. So this is my picture taken with my telephoto lens. And although you can kind of see it, this is what you're really looking at, which is a picture from the nature garden that we visited in Port Moresby. Beautiful bird. You can see this amazing headdress that he has that he displays. The other bird that's probably the more famous is the Reggiana bird of paradise. This is the premier bird that everyone goes to New Guinea to see. And we saw several different areas where we saw the birds and we were able to see them display. Okay, I don't have it on here. And then I have a picture of the display, which I guess is later in the presentation. But just as we went down the backside of Rondon Ridge, here's just a few of the things that we found. So Bulbophyllum triaristella, which a lot of us have in our collections, which I think originally came from Dick Emery, who traveled to New Guinea, I think maybe in the 80s or something, but a lot of us have this species in our collections. We found this weird little thing growing next to the trail. I still don't know what it was. It's not an orchid. This amazing section monosepalum bulbophyllum, where the actual length of the sepals was probably 8 to 9 inches long. Another bulbophyllum trachyanthem, and then this weird little fuzzy bulbophyllum. Well, after our stay in Mount Hagen, we then drove to a different part of the highlands called the Chiba province to visit Mount Wilhelm. It's the highest mountain in New Guinea, and it's the highest mountain in Oceania. And for people that are peak baggers that climb the highest 14 mountains on different continents or whatever, this is one of the mountains that they go and climb. And this is a view from the Alpine lake that's basically near the top of the mountain. To get there, we started in Mount Hagen. We drove down a sort of highway. I mean, it was paved. It took us quite a while to get there. Had lunch in this little town and then went up this god-awful road. Part of it was new, but then as we got towards Mount Wilhelm, it got progressively worse. And this last little part here, which is probably only 10 miles, probably took as long to drive as all of the rest of the trip. So it was not an easy trip to get there. And our hosts there were very proud of this new highway that the Chinese had built because I guess it used to take about 12 hours to go from here to here until the Chinese built this new highway. And sadly, about 3 months after we returned, they had a horrible rainstorm and it washed out the road. And so now you can't get there at all. They have to rebuild the road, and our guests, our hosts have to walk, I think it's like 5 miles across this area where the road basically slid down the mountain. So here we are on the way, just taking a little rest. We went in a group of 4x4s with our luggage and so forth on the roof. And then we got to this place called Betty's Lodge, which is shown here. It's a rustic, basically lodge, mostly fitted out for climbers that come in groups and climb the mountain. And she was just so delighted to have people here that were orchid lovers. And so she still has been in touch with me, sending me orchid photos and so forth from in and around their property. They have this wonderful garden that is just full of flowers and all kinds of fresh vegetables. They have a trout pond. She raises trout from little tiny things and sells them all over New Guinea. So we had fresh trout almost every night for dinner, fresh strawberries. And this is Betty Higgins, who is the owner of Betty's Lodge, showing off one of her Serrata stylus plants that she had growing in her garden. So just walking in and around the woods around Betty's Lodge, we found lots of orchids. And here's just a few of them, this wonderful bulbophyllum, some very large terrestrials that I think are calanthes, more Glossopteris species, another big Dendrobium rigidifolium. We saw that earlier, as well as this Liparis, which seemed to be fairly common throughout the highlands. And then this really unusual bulbophyllum. I mean, look at this, I guess it's the lip or the petals with all these fuzzy things on it. I'm sure Ron likes it because it's got lots of frills and fringes on it, but it was a very cute little bulbophyllum. And then some more bulbophyllums, this one in section Pedocylus. We did find some Oberonia, again, species unidentified, this very strange flowering tree, which Ron thinks is a Myrtaceae, more Serrata stylus and calanthes. And after climbing for hours up from the base lodge, up to the top of the alpine area, we finally come out of this dense rainforest into this really amazing tree fern forest with a whole different type of plants growing on it. So we came out of a dense, wet forest into this area that was quite a bit drier. And then here we have these wonderful tree ferns all over the place. And this is where Dendrobium decocii grows. So it grows on these lichen and moss covered trees. And there were quite a few plants of it, not that many in bloom. And apparently when you go higher, they're a lot more abundant than they were just when we came out of the woods. And here's a close-up of the decocii here. We also found this cute little leafless orchid at Teniophyllum. Again, species not identified. Well, it took us so long to get up to the top of this open area, probably about 5 hours of climbing. And the rest of us turned around and went back down. It started to pour and got, quite slippery and difficult to walk. But Dennis Chesko decided he was going to climb, he was going to bag the peak. So he went on with a couple of the guides, and Betty had outfitted him with I guess a sleeping bag, and there's a little hut towards the top. So he basically climbed the rest of the day, got to the hut, and then got up at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning and climbed to the peak of Mount Wilhelm. So here's Dennis at the top making his 14,700 and whatever it was foot climb. And then he basically came back down the mountain all the next day. And then here again are just some of the orchids we saw on the way down the mountain. Serrata stylus, we saw more Cuthbertsonii on the trees and also in and around Betty's property. And again, more bulbophyllum species. Well, that was our trip to the highlands. And from there, we went to the capital of Port Moresby. It's the capital and largest city in the country, and it is considered one of the most dangerous cities in the world. It's definitely not a place you want to just go walking around. But if you go on your bus with your guide, you can see some really interesting things. We visited the fish market, the nature park, a national park called Verirada, and I think well worth visiting are the Parliament buildings in the National Museum. And this picture here is just from the National Museum. So the fish market is quite famous. Everyone comes here to buy their fresh fish, and it's pretty amazing when you see what the fishermen catch just off the island here. So there's an amazing variety of fish that were for sale. And again, everybody was super friendly, wanted their pictures taken, wanted to talk to you and tell you about their fish. We visited a nature park, which is contains the National Orchid Garden as well. And it has a very large collection of the native fauna of New Guinea, including many of the birds as well as the tree kangaroos and some of the other couscous and other rare species. And interestingly, this is the Victoria pigeon. It's native to Papua New Guinea. And then this crazy little parrot, I guess used to be somebody's pet, and they donated him to the nature park. And as soon as you walked into the bird enclosure, he would fly over and jump on your shoulder, and you could not get rid of him. He just would stick there. So it was really difficult to get out of there without leaving with this parrot on your shoulder. We visited the National Orchid Garden. Here we're at sea level, so pretty much all of the orchids were the antilopier type, very warm growing, and basically just displayed on stumps in and around the garden. And then here's a few more of the birds. Cassowaries are very revered, not really a pet, but more of a status symbol in New Guinea. And then this is the only heron species that occurs in New Guinea. And then here's a picture of the orchid garden. And you can see here we have the different antilopier type orchids and Laturia type orchids all tied onto these posts and displayed in and around the garden. An interesting place to visit nearby is this national park called Verirata National Park. It's about a 2-hour drive from the city of Port Moresby, and you climb up into the hills, but you're still fairly low. I think the elevation here at most was maybe 300 meters. And we went to see this guy, and we had to get there at, oh God, I think it was, we left at about 4 o'clock in the morning because these guys display and they are done by 7 o'clock. So you got to get there early. And here's the display. Now these are the males. This is the Raguiana bird of paradise. And we actually were able to see them mate. So these are 2 males, but eventually he attracted a female and they actually mated. So that was a real treat, but it's a kind of long movie and it wasn't in very good focus. This one came out quite nice. On the way out of the park though, the real treat that we saw, we were coming out on the bus and we'd heard that this Bulbophyllum fletcherianum grew on some large rocks near the park. So everybody was looking out the windows of the bus. I think Dennis Chesko spotted it off the side of the road. There were these great big rocks, and there growing on the rocks was Bulbophyllum fletcherianum. The leaves of this orchid are about 3 feet long. This is a big, stinky flowering orchid. And this was as close as we could get because it was growing above this very grassy area. And this part of New Guinea is renowned for this incredibly venomous snake called a taipan that occurs at this elevation and likes grass. So we did not go tromping through the grass to get a close-up of this orchid, but it was still pretty cool to see it. We then visited the Parliament buildings, which are a wonderful piece of architecture, well worth visiting. And it's not unusual for the tribesmen to come to the Parliament in their full regala and argue their case before Parliament. So it's a very interesting cultural place with all of these different tribes and cultures represented in this Parliament. And then there's a wonderful cultural museum right next to it that is just full of all kinds of different artifacts of the different tribes. And you could spend hours there. It was a fascinating place, lots to see. Okay, so after that, some of our group left to go back to the US, and a few of us continued on to New Britain. And we joined up with my editor and publisher, Stuart McPherson, who had set up the tour that we were going to go visit Rabaul on the very tip of the island of New Britain. So this is still part of New Guinea, but it's one of the islands, the largest island off the coast. And this trip was mostly time out for orchids. We were planning to go see some, and you'll understand why in a minute. We didn't see very many, but we did have a great time. We went snorkeling. This is one of the best dive areas in the world. It's just amazing, great reefs. And on top of that, all kinds of sunken airplanes and ships from World War II. You can go swimming with the dolphins, which I did, which was really cool. We climbed this volcano over here, more about that in a minute. You can explore artifacts. We did go on a trip to find orchids at Wild Dog Mine, so I'll talk about that. And then at the end, we'll talk about the binding fire dancers. So Rabaul, it was as of 1990, so this is an old picture, a big city that's on the northern tip of New Guinea, of New Britain. And so here's how it looked pre-1994. And in 1994, this volcano basically blew up and incinerated the entire town and covered the rest of it with feet of ash and basically destroyed the entire town. So there's still bits of Rabaul there, but mostly you drive around, the streets are still there. There's a few buildings poking up out of the ash, but there's not much left of the town. And some of us decided, I'm not sure how intelligent this was, because we did this about 2 weeks before that volcano blew up in New Zealand, killing all kinds of people. But anyway, Mount Turvaver, which is an active volcano, you can climb up it. So about 6 of us climbed up the mountain and went up to the top. And so here we are at the top, and you can just hear it. I mean, it's gurgling and burbling and so forth. So it's it's definitely a live volcano. And it actually did explode in 2014. So here's a picture of it exploding in 2014. And interesting, all around the volcano were all kinds of pumice, which was actually floating in the water. So the water had all of these floating rocks in it around it. Rabaul was the site of Japanese occupation during World War II, and there's all kinds of artifacts all over the place. If you're a World War II buff, I mean, you'll see everything, old tanks, planes, boats, etc., all over the place. It is interesting to see it all. And then we made a trip up to Wild Dog Mine. So in going to New Britain, I had done some research and made friends with Neville Howcraft, who studied the orchids in New Britain up until about the last 10 years. He's now in his 90s. So, but he lives in Australia, and he gave us this wonderful site to go visit called the Wild Dog Mine. And it was incredibly complicated to arrange because we had to drive through the land of about 4 different tribes to get up to the mine. We had to pick up people from each tribe as we went along the way. So by the time we actually got up to where the mine was, it was almost 11 o'clock. And we just started to find orchids. We found, you know, a few things in the trees and so forth. And it was just starting to get really good. And then the skies opened up and it just poured. And it just showed no signs of letting up. So after about an hour of trying to wait it out, we gave up and we got back in our Jeeps. And this little creek that had been just a trickle that was about 1 foot wide and 1 foot deep, when we got here was a raging torrent that was well over the tops of the wheels and the doors in the Jeeps. And so we had to get across it. And basically what they did is they just backed up and took a running leap at it with the Jeep and drove all the way across it. We actually floated across it with the guy kind of steering it. And we made it all the way across to the other side. And then so I got over on the first Jeep and I was trying to take a movie of the second Jeep coming over, and I pushed the wrong button on my camera, so I didn't get it. But it was quite the adventure. So I didn't know that 4-wheel drives could swim, but I can attest to the fact that they can to a limited extent. Okay, last cultural thing was the Baima banning fire dancers. And again, these guys are really famous. They have these very elaborate headdresses that they wear. Their costumes are all made of different leaves and things from the forest. They don't have any shoes on. And basically what they do is they burn these enormous piles of brush and they dance around it and they get into a frenzy and then they start dancing right through the fire. And they did this for hours. So they kept going through the fire, you know, with their bare feet. I mean, they didn't stand in it, but they basically did go through it multiple times. And then the music was basically these guys beating on logs. So there's these thumping noises as they would dance. he's the wizard or something. He has a different role in the ceremony. But this traditionally would go on all night until they ran out of things to burn. It was quite the ceremony. After that, we made one last trip. We went by boat to one of the small islands off of New Britain. It was quite the adventure. I thought we were all going to drown, but we made it there. It was a beautiful little spot. We had a nice picnic lunch, and we found a few orchids in the trees, just growing in and around the shore, which I think is probably what this whole area must have looked like before it was extensively modified by man. A lot of the native forest of New Britain has been cut down and replaced by oil palms and coconut palms and so forth. So there's not that much original forest left, but the few places you do see it, you definitely can find orchids. So I hope that you enjoyed that. If you like to come on an Orchids in the Wild trip, I hope you realize that we see more than orchids on our trips. And you can learn more about our trips from the website. And then this is just my mask and artifact collection from my trip to New Guinea. I actually brought an empty suitcase with me just to bring back masks and other things, and it was well worth it. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to take questions. Before I end, I just wanted to acknowledge all the people that went on the trip with us: Lois and Larry Dalsberg, Robin and Bob Erickson, Kyle Goodman, Spiro Kosomanakis, Kate Klum, Dennis Chesko, and Gary Yonggi. And then Stuart McPherson for the New Britain part. And then my guides and orchid collectors and tour operators in New Guinea, Paul Yafisi, Pim Mamandi, Max Mall, Pent Kupal, and Betty and Peter Higgins. And then thank you, Ron, for helping me ID at least some of the orchids. And then again, thank you to Neville for steering us to the wild dog mine, even though we'll have to go back and visit it another time with better planning. Okay, thank you.
Yay. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Mary, this
Yeah,
is Ernie Cattler. Can you hear me?
yeah.
My wife and I had our honeymoon in Papua New Guinea in 1985.
That was quite the adventure.
What's all that? What I was saying is that this was a wonderful talk because we were there in 1985 and seeing Mount Hagen. We were in Mount Hagen and we were the only Caucasians there. And it was like about, 1/10 of what you saw. And the difference, no one had cell phones. And the difference in clothing and we visited the Mendi people, the Wigman. We visited a Sing Sing that was from one tribe to another, but it was, they tried to buy it. They actually jokingly tried to buy Anne. They weren't sure if she was a boy or a girl because she was wearing pants. But it was interesting to see the culture has changed so much as you described in 35 years. And I once gave a talk and there was someone there who'd been there in the 60s and it was another big leap, from that to 85 and 85 now to 220. So it's really interesting to see how the last really Paleolithic kind of culture and unexplored area is just now merging with the 20th century. I don't know if anybody heard me.
Okay, Mary, one question. If you were there in New Britain with Stuart McPherson, was he working on a new carnivorous plant book there?
Not in New Britain, no.
Ah, okay.
Now he just finished, he did a new Nepenthes book, but he wasn't working on it then. So he takes people on tours. It's one of the ways he makes a little bit of extra money.
Okay.
My first trip to New Guinea, I went with him in 2018. And then we planned the New Britain trip as a cooperation between him, and he had one fellow that was with him from another trip. And then we had several people from the OCA trip that went on the New Britain leg of the trip.
Great. Thank you, Mary. That was great. Any other questions?
That's wonderful.
So Mary, did you end up speaking any Pidgin English or practice at all when you were there?
Well, it's interesting. You can understand it because it's just basically phonetic English that's spelled bizarrely. So,
Can you say something in Pidgin English?
well, like where you would get your cell phone cards. So everyone has a cell phone, but they have to buy time on their cards, right? So they would go to these little booths and they'd give them a few kinas and they would get, an hour of time on their phone. And so all of those booths were called tapahia, which meant top up here, which was kind of funny. And there was just, little bits like that, but you could hear it when they were talking to each other. You could understand it, but it was a basic, almost English, I guess I would call it.
Are there any plans to build more roads or to modernize? I mean, their parliament building looked very contemporary and clearly some of them have Western dress, so that it's a blend of ancient with an attempt to be somewhat modern, but it is politically, is there any effort to
Yeah, I think that development always comes with its problems. It destroys the environment, et cetera,
Yeah.
et cetera.
The culture, everything.
Everything. And so there is quite a bit of road building going on, mostly done by the Chinese, who are basically going in and building roads to mines and basically taking everything out of the value out of the island. And so I actually think it's kind of a travesty what's going on with the road building more than advancing it. And they build these roads that, if you've ever been to China, they build really shitty roads. I mean, they look really nice, and then 3 years later they fall apart.
Fall apart, yeah.
And that's basically the road that they built into Mount Wilhelm was like that. I mean, it was a horrible road before. They bulldozed all this stuff, made all these things, but they didn't shore up the banks. You could see how that one good rainstorm would bring the whole top of the mountain down on them, which is exactly what happened. And they're just temporary things. And not only that, but they make the country give over all kinds of rights by so-called building these roads for free. So they end up owning the ports and they own the access to the mines, and it's kind of an evil empire that's going on.
Mary, what do they use to paint their face?
I think that they're natural things, bits of colored clay. I don't know where the ochre comes from, and I'm not a potter or something, but I know there's lots of minerals and things that have colors in them, and that's what they use. I mean, they weren't using paint sets or anything. They actually had these. Actually, some of them did have artificial paints, but most of what they seemed to be using were natural paints. So
They also have a lot of root vegetables and other kinds of fruits and vegetables that have natural color.
Yeah, that could also be.
So I suspect, because you didn't mention taro, but I wondered if they use taro root, as you find in Samoa and some of the other islands. But I wondered, did you have any sense of what their education system was like?
Well, basically very minimal, other than in some of the larger towns, which was why a lot of the tribes were represented in Mount Hagen, because it actually had a high school, I think. So there's elementary education that's basically done by the churches all over the island. So you see a lot of little schools. So the kids learn probably up to about a 6th grade education. And I think anything beyond that, they have to, go to a big city or something, and that gets really complicated. Like I said, it's all tribal. They need to stay within their tribe. One of the things that we all brought with us was little gifts, but the gifts that we brought were pencils, pens, pads of paper, school supplies. They just loved it. We would go to the village, and after they put on their demonstration for their, their culture, like the Hoolywigman dance and so forth, we gave out crayons and pencils and things like that to the kids, and they just loved it. They were practically fighting over all these school supplies because they're so hard for them to get.
That's what we took to China also, and those were incredibly popular. I took several bottles of bubbles, and they had never seen that, and they just went bonkers for it. But
Wow.
yeah, school supplies, that's interesting.
Yeah, so if you do go visit, it's a good idea to bring that kind of stuff with you, and not candy, but things like, little toys and school supplies and things like that.
This was outstanding. Thank you so much. And glad you have the culture stuff in there because it's more than just the plants. It sounds like an orchid paradise or plant paradise, but the culture of the people in the different tribes is what's so fascinating because it's a land that's still unexplored and undeveloped. It's incredible.
Yeah, I was planning on going back, well, before the pandemic, and do an exploration trip to try to find some places where we could do more trekking and see, more orchids in the wild rather than in gardens, because it is so difficult to get around there. So that was all planned, but everything's up in the air right now because it's just not feasible.
All right. Thank you so much, Mary. That was awesome. We are quite late. So not that we minded because that was amazing. But I'm going to give out those gift codes, or not the codes, but the winners of our Tiny Jungle gift certificates and our Farm Fresh to You. So first person is Ron Parsons. We have Cecil Bullard, Miki Ichiyanagi, Kay Klum, Adam Farrar, Roberta Fox, Sarah Haydeen, I believe, Hannah Hardy, Judy Carney, and Eugen Kim for our Tiny Jungle winners. Yay. And then we'll email you those codes after the meeting if you are a winner. And for our Farm Fresh to You, we have Diane Ward. Congrats to the winners. Make sure you're a member in good standing so you can get your prize if we do happen to pick your name. Yeah, thank you so much again, Mary. Thanks, Lynn, for the slideshow. Thanks, Jeff, for helping me out, and all of you for bearing with me. With that, I'll see you all next month. Hopefully I'll see you at the show meeting. Yeah, have a good one, everybody.
And hopefully it'll be in person. If all goes well, it'll be in person next month.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks,
Nice job,
Corey.
Corey.
Good job. Really good job.
Thank you.
See you in person.
Ciao. Wow. Wow, wow.
Okay. Winding down. Corey, do you have any questions before I hang up? Are we good? Oh, you're muted. No?
I don't think so. I think I'm good.
All righty.
Thank you.
Just let me know.
Sure.
Thanks. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Good job.